Hello everyone and welcome to another Steel Division 2 video. This is the Townfight guide that I have been talking about for quite a while because someone wished for that. Feels like ages ago. It took me forever to make it because I was never really happy with how it was. And after the, I think, third re-recording now, we're finally there. This is, yeah, what you're going to see now. And I hope that it either helps that person that wished for it or at least helps all other newer players that stumble upon this. Now, what you can expect from this is really just giving you some guidance on your way to getting better at Steel Division 2 or getting started rather. This is really an introduction into Townfights, not so much a full-on guide how exactly you do it with every division and all these kind of things, right? So this is just a very general thing with some very general rules that should help you on your way if you're kind of lost on that topic so far. And with that, I think we're going to get into it. So the one thing that I do want to start with is the units, because of course you need to know what kind of units are good in towns and which ones aren't. But more importantly, you need to know what the roles of these units are in town fights. So we are going to start with the infantry. Now, in terms of infantry, really any infantry can be useful in a town fight setting. Okay. Now, there are specific type of units that are especially strong in towns and especially useful, at least, but you can use everything, basically. And a lot of things that are not going to be super strong in general will also not be super strong in towns. Some exceptions do exist, of course, and the other way is also true. Things that are generally good units will also be good units in towns, in most cases. So of course, you have range in towns, so you will need your line infantry in towns, and there are also places where you can use your CQC infantry. Now, the way you use these two is not exactly the same. Line infantry, of course, is your bread and butter. You use it both for offenses and defenses because you want to shoot at your opponent from a distance if you can. Now, the CQC infantry, on the other hand, is a little bit more situational. You usually want to use this more defensively by blocking out a certain area. So usually when you have your row of houses, there will be some houses where you can position your CQC infantry and you will only see the infantry, or you only have line of sight on the infantry while also being in range of that CQC infantry, and then you get absolutely smacked. So this is kind of the way you use those. You can use them offensively sometimes, of course, as well, but then you need to combine it with Halftrack or Armour, or use it just to clear out that one specific CQC unit that is defending, and it is quite annoying to do that sometimes. Now, what is especially noteworthy here is that the MP44 or M1 Carbine units can actually be quite strong in towns as well, whereas, of course, with their limited range, they are not super strong in a lot of other settings. That being said, you still have to be very careful because there's lots of line of sights, and you want to ideally position them somewhere where they can really just use their range and not get contested, and it's not able to contest them from outside their range. So they require a little bit more careful positioning, but they can be quite powerful there. They're also more of a defensive role there. Pushing with them is not so good, but they can absolutely shred anything that is outside of cover and walks into them. Right? This is basic. This is what you want to use them for. They are not meant for pushing, from my experience at least. And then, of course, what is especially powerful are certain hybrid units that are, first of all, hybrid units in the classical way that we mostly use this word when you have CQC tools and range tools. Great examples, of course, are the Brandenburger, but also Legionnaire, the Assault team, the Assault engineers, or for example, I forgot what they're called, but the CQC Flamer from Lessa with their MP44s, MG42s and the Flamer, because with those you can basically push in towns and defend in towns no matter what, right? You can fight off units that get too close at CQC range. You can fight off units that push you at range. You can also push. You don't need to stop to bring in CQC to clear out that one CQC unit with those. You can just continue to use them for that purpose as well. And the other thing that I do want to include there are any sort of infantry with bazookas or Piats. Of course, having AT infantry in general is useful, so even your German infantry with a Panzerfaust, or Soviet infantry with a AT rifle or an AT grenade is very useful, but especially these longer range tools like bazookas, Piats, Panzer Shreks are what you want, because there's lots of ranges in towns where you will run into bazooka range with your armor if you're not super careful, and you get a lot of kills with those kind of units. And of course, armor, as we're going to see, is also an important part of town fights. So you will see armor, and having these tools creates a lot of opportunity for you to get kills. But it is also especially crucial because if you have access to that infantry, that means that your opponent can never know if he's going to run into it. So he has to play it extra carefully, even though there might not be any bazookas there or any Piets or anything like that. But as long as he doesn't know that there's none there, he has to treat every situation as if there was one. And that is a serious limitation for your opponent. So this is especially why these kind of units are very powerful. Next up is armor. And when it comes to armor, we have to differentiate between what kind of armor. I'm going to bunch everything together from all the tabs, but we're going to go with light armor first, for example, and I think there we have to differentiate also between light armor that can deal with other armor and light armor that can't. So Halftracks and such, for example, are incredibly powerful, especially the 50 cal ones or the Dushkas for the Soviets, but you have to really be careful with how to use them. So one thing that you can do with those is you can position them defensively, where it just hold an area, so if your opponent moves in, they can start blasting that. You can also use them in a combined arms offensive in the town, and of course, you can generally bully your opponent a little bit if you can try to find angles that is not covered by his armor. Right, there's a lot of obstacles in the town, so you will usually fight safe angles. You can move in and out, you can hide in backyards, things like that. You will always find a use for these sort of light armor units there. You can also use them to scout for AT opportunities, right? If you're not sure if there's maybe bazooka somewhere hidden, and you have, for example, a 5-point Jeep half-track, you can use that to scout ahead and see if there's anything that can deal with it. If it doesn't die, you know that it is safe. If it dies, you know that something is there. So these are kind of things that you can do also, or just, you know, there's a row of houses, you don't really have much vision past it. You can try to send that in and see if there's armor or anything like that, and then you know what you can do and what you have to expect. So for these, there are very useful. Now, anything that has the penetration to deal with auto light armor or with tanks is, of course, incredibly useful, especially light tanks. I'm going to start with those, or just, you know, your light recon armor that has the pen to do it. With those, you can definitely get a lot done. I'm talking about limited pen here, so things that maybe can't do it frontally, but maybe like with side armor. Those, of course, you can use to counter your opponent's light armor, but also as there is a lot of angles in the towns, you can use them to maybe get some flanking maneuvers and maybe get some side shots on more expensive tanks, things like that. Then we have to talk about those light armor tanks or light tanks that have good pen and high rate of fire. Those are, of course, incredibly powerful as well in towns. Those you just pretty much use to counter other armor, right? This is what they're there for. They're there to generate positive traits, and because we're up close, they should generally hit, and they should still be able to pen, right? Because with limited light tanks with decent but not fantastic pen, like Valentine's, for example, you have to be aware that at long distances, the pen might not be guaranteed, but up close, it will very likely pen. And of course, we also go to the medium tanks that are priced like a light tank, basically, but have decent pen. So this is the Panzer III, for example, or the Turans. Those are also incredibly useful in towns. With those, you have to be a little bit careful still with your positioning. You don't necessarily have to go for flankings, but you still have to be aware that you want to maintain, let's say, a distance of around 1,000 meters max. Yes, they can shoot longer, but you don't really want to do it right. You want to make sure that you definitely hit and that you're definitely going to get the pen. This is what you're really aiming for with those kind of tanks. And for that, they are absolutely fantastic. Now, then we get to the mediums. And this is where things starts to split up a little bit between what is not useful and what not, right? Previously, up to the medium tanks, I would say pretty much everything is useful. It really just depends on what you use it for, right? Even units that just do not, like some of these French light tanks that are super cheap, that probably won't kill any even medium tanks, those are completely fine for town fights as well. You spam them around, they're super annoying for infantry, they deal with the half-tracks if your opponent has them, so these are useful. at any time. Now, of course, there are different levels of useful, right? I would rather have a light tank that can also properly deal with other light tanks and still annoy infantry over a light tank that cannot do that. But those that can't are usually cheap. Again, I'm more going towards the cheap French ones, or I think, what's it called? Brondinana has some of these super cheap, really trashy tanks too, and that's okay, right? They cost accordingly, so that you can spam them around and be annoying for infantry. You can even waste them, but with those you have to be a little bit more careful. Going back to that, maybe I was covering that a little bit too fast. With those, you have to be a little bit more careful that you're not just wasting them because they're cheap, because that will add up, right? The cost that you lose with those. So just keep that in mind. But with the medium tanks, this is where really the differences started, and not everything is useful anymore. So we're going to start with, once again, those that are technically mediums but feel more like light tanks in terms of price. Those, of course, are absolutely fantastic. So everything that is hyper efficient, that has high rate of fire, decent pen, is absolutely fantastic. Again, Panzer III, for example, great example for towns. Now, what also is very powerful are the Shermans. The Shermans do have a hidden stat that you do not see in the stat block, and that is the stabilizer, which means it is very fast at aiming and shooting initially. And this is a massive advantage in towns, right? As you maybe get across a corner, or you just know you have limited line of sight, so you will go in and out of line of sight sometimes very quickly. So having a tank that aims very fast is incredibly powerful there, and might also be allowing you to get a side shot off on your opponent while that tank is only about to realize that there is another tank, and just turning while your Sherman just, aims super fast and starts shooting immediately. These are, of course, also especially powerful because they have 50 cals to support that. So this combination, 50 cal and shooting fast, even though the penetration is limited, is incredibly useful in towns. Same goes for Wolverines, or M10s as they are called in the American decks. Incredibly powerful for the same reason. Yeah, it's limited, you have less armor, but that's still fine. Now, other medium tanks that are incredibly useful in towns are anything that is cheap and will just trade up overall, right? The T-34, for example, is much cheaper than a Sherman. So this thing is still great, even though it doesn't have the stabilization, because on average, you will still at least either trade evenly or even out-trade your opponent, even though Sherman might shoot faster and things like that. The T-34s generally also have the pen to deal with those quite nicely. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we do have medium tanks like the Panzer IV, for example. That is not as good for towns. Why? The reason is relatively simple. While it has a good pen and it has similar armor or the same armor actually as a Wolverine, so it can't be that bad, the Panzer IV doesn't have the stabilization, and the armor can consistently be penned by the Sherman, even though sometimes it bounces. And that just means that overall, the Panzer IV tends to lose, even though it has a powerful gun and is actually cheaper than the Sherman. You still end up trading poorly at the end of the day. It sounds a bit weird, but this is generally what it comes up to. And the big reason why Panzer IVs are generally not that great for towns. Now, you would prefer still the Panzer IV over a heavy tank, of course, in a town on the Axis side, but it's definitely not ideal if you have to use that. Now, other things that I'm just going to classify this as mediums are anything that in the tank, the AT tab as well, of course. There are some tank hunters that are incredibly useful, and that kind of brings me to my next topic on mediums. Tanks that are not that good for towns are anything that does not have a turret, because it takes longer for you to actually be able to shoot. That means that your opponent's probably going to get the first shot off, and when they both start shooting now, your opponent might still be faster with the second, depending on how things go. And that's definitely a big disadvantage. So sometimes you might, for example, with a Stück, you might lose your Stück to Sherm before you even get to shoot your first shot. And that's, of course, far from ideal. Now, this issue, of course, is true for Martyrs, for example, or SU-76s and things like that. But those are not that big of a problem. Why? Because they are cheap. Once again, if it is cheap, that limitation is not that big. And especially in the case of the SU-76, this thing also has an incredibly fast rate of, or not incredible, but it has a good rate of fire, and that helps a lot. This means that it can kind of make up for that initial disadvantage, and that is fantastic. Now, something that is okay, I would say, are the SU-85s. Once again, they are just cheap enough that it is still okay, but still, if you have the same Fumada still, even though they are cheap, in generally speaking, if you can avoid it, you don't want to have turretless units in the towns, just because of that issue that they really can struggle against other medium armor because of their because they need to turn first to actually be able to start shooting. So that's definitely a big topic there. Now, there are some notable exceptions here that are just strong enough in general to make it worthwhile, and that's Stückfuß and Jagdpanzerfuß. Because of the armor, they are very hard to kill. Hetzers as well, by the way. These can be very hard to kill for your opponent, at least if it's Western allies. So these are actually quite useful against Western allies. Against Axis, of course, it really depends. Jagdpanzer 4 is still pretty strong against Axis as well, but the Stück 4, for example, can be penned on much easier by Axis armor. But this is something to keep in mind. These turretless tanks are very limited in their use. Sometimes it is really a case-to-case based on whether it's good or not. Now, with those, you always want to make sure that you're angled already to where the threat is going to be. And on some maps, and some town maps, for example, is not that big of a deal. Look at Orsha East, for example. The town is relatively linear. So as you get into the town, you're generally speaking already facing towards the direction of your opponent, and in that case, it's not that big of a problem. But in other cases, it can be, for example, on Kostritsa. There might be some places where it's not that good. Harashai is another famous town map where you might have to turn, and in those situations, these kind of tanks really suffer a lot. That's just something to keep in mind there. And then, of course, you get to the heavy tanks, and heavy tanks really should not be used in towns. Heavy tanks have no business whatsoever being in towns. Sometimes you know that your opponent just does not have an answer to them even up close, and then you might want to do it. But still, if that's true, if that's the case, it might still be better using a more cost-efficient medium tank there, because you still don't want to have your expensive tank to die to a Panzerschreck or Panzerfaust or whatever is going to be in there. So you have to be careful with those, and they're usually just also too expensive for what you get out of them, right? You don't, if a cheaper tank will do the job for you, then there's no point in investing into a heavy one. And then last note, of course, are any sort of support tanks. This is mostly focused on the German ones, because, for example, the M8 Scott is, I would cover that under the first part of light armor that can't really deal with infantry, that can only deal with infantry, basically. But the German support tanks can also be very useful in town settings, as they provide the much needed suppression for infantry that the regular tanks just cannot provide, compared to a Sherman with a 50 cal, for example, and they can still deal with light armor quite nicely. Now, generally speaking, to kind of close the armor section of this, what you definitely have to keep in mind is that one of the most annoying things for your opponent to deal with is if you have light armor everywhere. So if you know that your opponent has limited tools to deal with light armor, just try to sprinkle your light armor across the whole map, the whole town, and just bombard him with small little pushes that are super annoying and kind of overwhelm him a little bit. Otherwise, you just go to the classic grind. This is basically how you use armor in towns. Now, what are other good tools? Because the rest I'm just going to kind of bunch together. So, for example, your machine guns and your assault guns are all still useful in towns. You have to be a little bit more careful with where to use them, right? You want to make sure that you do get the range advantage that those need, or you just use them in a combination of other support tools as well, and then that's okay, even if you don't have the range advantage. But those have a little bit limited use. You can, for example, cover off a road or something like that. For those, they are fantastic. 50mm mortars, of course, can be quite useful in towns, although the non-Soviet ones are much harder to use. But those are still useful in general. Of course, Recon is very important, and then we get to the AT. AT is, so we've talked about the tanks. The guns themselves are a mixed bag. In some towns, it can be very useful to cover off a main road, especially if your opponent parks a tank there to cover that same main road. In other matchups, it might be better to just not do that and kind of not use them. Sometimes you can also use them for other angles. It really depends a lot on how things are looking. These are generally very situational. It's not, what is not a good idea with AT guns is to just cover off every possible angle right at the start of the game, because your opponent might just not push there, or your opponent might push in there with infantry, and then you're kind of screwed. So just relying on AT guns for towns is definitely not ideal. You can use them with a mix. If you don't have any armor yourself, you can use them with a combination of bazookas and things like that. And of course, a strong infantry deployment to make sure that nothing gets into range of shooting at your AT guns. This is very crucial, but otherwise, ideally, you want to use a mix of your own armor and then potentially have some AT guns in there as well. Now, what is, of course, very useful is all sorts of artillery. Mortars, off-map, incredibly useful. Howitzers are still very useful to, pin and kill things. And, of course, some sort of rocket artillery, especially short-range ones like the Wolfram, which in towns you don't need to worry of not being in range. These are all very useful tools that you will also rely on and should use extensively for towns. Next topic, and then we're going to get into some actual strategies and little tips and tricks that you can do, is we need to talk about everything vision related. And the first thing, of course, is recon. So, of course, recon in town is a little bit tricky because you often can't see very far. Now, sometimes there are angles from outside of the town where you have hills and things like that, where you can position recon, and that helps as well. This is definitely something that I would recommend doing. And then you also have the church towers. The church towers, even though the line of sight tool doesn't tell you that, church towers actually see a lot. And you will see a clip playing right now where you can see the difference of the player with the church tower and the player with who has nothing in the church tower. And it is massive. So whenever you can put recon in the church tower, this really is a must do. But there are some other tools that can help you when it comes to vision. And I'm meaning both getting vision yourself or denying it to your opponent. And one of the first things that you can do is put things on return fire, right? So that things in units in building remain relatively hidden. So one thing that you can do is put them on return fire if you know that there's no point in fighting right now, but your opponent might run into them and then they can do something. This is especially useful for bazooka infantry because your opponent might not realize or forget that they're there and then drive up to close with a tank and then you can get a kill with that. But it is also very useful for other types of infantry that might just get shredded. For example, especially if you have something in a forward position where if it starts firing, it would get absolutely shredded because there's so many enemy units there. But it also provides you with a lot of vision on those units. This is incredibly useful. Put it on return fire, make sure that it doesn't shoot, make sure that it doesn't reveal itself, and just enjoy the vision that you get. Another thing that you can do is turn off the autocar. I would always recommend you to have it on by default, but you can turn it off manually and then put units behind buildings. And this is, I'm going to put this into the vision category. We're once again going to get back into it when we talk about specific strategies and whatnot, but this is another thing that you can do and should take advantage of. Let's now start with going into a little bit more details about how you actually can fight to win in towns. Now, the unfortunate thing for you is that there's not the general strategy. Okay, there's not the way of winning a town fight. Instead, there are a lot of general principles that you should follow and tricks that can help you to win in town fights. The specifics always depend on the town that you're fighting in, as well as the specific matchup, and of course also your situation. If you're about to get pushed out of the town, that's not the same as you're in the middle of the town fighting. So, what are some general principles that you should be following and keep in mind? So first of all is keep the line of sights in mind. Right, this is a tricky one. There's a lot of angles and line of sights in town. So your unit get spotted from somewhere you don't want to? Can your units do your units have some good line of sights? And keep in mind that the line of sight tool is wonky. So sometimes you just have to kind of wing it a little bit and be like, yeah, okay, that looks like it might have a line of sight there. I wouldn't count on it, but you just have to keep that in mind. And then also keep the ranges in mind, because of course there are definitely some line of sights where you can actually have some decent ranges that might allow you to sneak an AT gun, for example, to shoot a tank that you otherwise might not have wanted to engage, or the same thing could happen to you. So things like that are important to remember. Now, the other thing is keep your tanks safe. What does this mean? Well, if they are idle, make sure that they're only visible from line of sight where you have things to guard that as well, so that your opponent cannot just sneak in an AT gun and kill those off. Also, keep your safe distance to buildings. This is true for defenses as pushes alike. You don't want to get too close to buildings unless you know for a fact that they are clear, because otherwise you might lose to a Panzerfaust, or even worse, a Panzerschreck or AT grenade. Now the next thing is spread out. If you're attacking, you want to spread out, because of otherwise, and this is not specific to towns, because otherwise fire might just pin multiple of your units at the same time. And of course, you do not want to, in town fights, if you're defensive or things get into a bit of a stalemate, artillery will probably be used at some point, and then you don't want to have everything pinned at once. And it's very easy in towns to kind of just buckle up, like push everything in one place, but it's not a good thing. Worst thing that can happen to you is you get off-mapped and all your units are just pinned at once. If it's a larger town where the off-map can't hit everything that you're currently covering, or all the ground that is yours, if you spread out nicely, you might have some units that might still be able to put up a defense. It also gives you better coverage and makes it harder for your opponent to sneak in and push in, and it also gives you better vision. So it's just all advantages of that. Next thing is try to position units in a way that they can cover each other. This is true for when you push. You want to have fire support nicely placed. So a lot of, once again, we go back to the line of sights basically, right? You want to have places where units can cover each other, or where you can generate crossfires, things like that. Also, once again, talking about line of sights, do not forget to look at angles from outside the tank, and make likewise sure that you're not exposing yourself to them. A good example for this is Slutsk. Look at the regular Slutsk maps, there's two hills next to it. There's a lot of angles from the hill. Now, unfortunately, once again, the line of sight tool is sometimes not very useful for that, because it might not give you the full picture, but just keep those in mind. Try to use the advantage of those hills if they are existing. For example, it doesn't happen very often, but in Halftracks, for example, you can sometimes also make use of that. Just, look for that. You don't even need the hill. Sometimes you just have good line of sight from somewhere else as well, and you want to use them. Now, the next thing is use the front line and the tool, as well as your knowledge and experience, to kind of predict enemy positions if you don't have vision. Now, why do I say that? Well, the truth is that in town fights, very often it is a little bit of a guessing and trying to find your opponent. You will never fully know the full picture. Even if you have Recon in the church tower, that's just limited information, because things in houses or behind houses might not be able to be spotted. It might just be too stealthy. So you have to do that a little bit of guessing, but it helps you a lot if you pay attention to the frontline tool, because that gives you so much information. So try to make use of that. Another thing, if you don't have much experience yet, just, do some rational thinking, or you can do that in generally. Where could units be hidden? Where does it make sense for units to be hidden to prevent you from pushing? Okay. And as I said, a lot of it is trying and guessing. That is an inevitable part of town fighting. And then, of course, where vision is missing, you can use cheap units to try and get it. For example, send a half-track out to see if there's AT guns or tanks, or even spot infantry. Hop a cheap infantry unit into a building, and then you might see things. It might get shredded, but you can also push back out. Then you know where things are. Don't do this when you're not planning to push or are afraid that you are getting soon pushed, right? Do it when it also benefits, because otherwise you're just going to waste units. But you can definitely do things like that. Now, some don'ts: do not let tanks stand out in the open with Recon, as I said. Do never push tanks forward unsupported. This is true in general, but especially in towns. You want to always have infantry first, then the tanks come. Change positions unnecessarily is something that you shouldn't do. Why? Because it just reveals your unit. Okay, so if there's no point to change position of your unit, just leave it there and it will do the job. And then also don't use a lot of AT guns to cover off each possible angle. Make sure that you have a combination of infantry with AT weapons, AT guns, and armor that does the trick, that allows you some flexibility, because everything else is just too static and too easily targeted and not flexible enough if a push through actually happens. Now, when it comes to pushing into a town, there is actually somewhat of a common recipe that you can follow. Now, first of all, combined arms is king as always. Make sure that your infantry, that you have infantry, make sure that you have some CQC ready where needed, support it with mortars to soften up the place, and have, you know, some fire support by armor ready. That's kind of how it works. But yeah, secondly, always send the infantry first and make sure that you have some armored support behind that, especially valuable tanks, so that they don't get killed by bazookas. Then use artillery and planes where you see fit, right? Either in advance by shelling and bombing positions where you know that your opponent is, or by, yeah, when you spot the positions as you are pushing. In those cases, I think mortars and air support are a little bit better than howitzers, just because they are a little bit faster in their reaction time, because by the time your howitzer will have aimed and the shots have arrived, you probably either have your push has been stopped or you have pushed past that position, so that's not really super useful. Now, the next thing, of course, that you can do, and the last thing, is off map. This is the easy way to take it down. Nuke it with an off map, then a follow up. Otherwise, do not buy the off map at all. Okay, so whenever you use an off map, this is true for everything, not just town fighting, but in town is where we often use the off map. You really do have to follow up. So you either want to have units ready to follow up right away, or you have a half track to just drive through and surround the things. That also works, but you have to do one of those things. Now, you have to be aware that the off map often doesn't kill. Some do, but often lots of them don't, and it won't kill everything that is there. Some exceptions excluded. And also on top of that, you should bear in mind that your off map might not generate the same point losses in your opponent that you had to spend to buy it. So very often it's trading terrain for points with the off map. Not always, but sometimes it is. And this is just something that you have to accept. But if you do it correctly, you should end up in a favorable position that should keep you some flags for a long time, and maybe may even force your opponents to lose a lot of units trying to counter push. So this is kind of how this works, but you need to do it correctly. But off maps, of course, in towns, very, very useful, but you shouldn't just do them, put them down, and then at some point later push. You need to follow up right away. This is not the same as grinding an area down with artillery. Now let's get down to some micro-specific options and tricks. I would divide them into two sets, basic and advanced. That doesn't necessarily mean that one of them is harder to do than the other, but I would say the basic one is should be in your toolkit to be good at town fights, and the other one just brings it to the next level. This is not exclusive, this list. There are many things that I have forgotten. Now, same as for the other part, but especially for the micro tricks, I should also give you a shout out to Yapasa, who has given me some of his opinions and advices for this guide, and as listed, also gave me a list of some of his favorite micro tricks that you can keep in mind. So we're going to start with the basic one though. So the first one, in my opinion, is move armor in and out of cover, especially with fast aiming time units, Shermans, for example. These are fantastic for this. So move out, shoot, move back in. This is something that you can do very well, and if you do it from different angles, for example, you can even kill something that you need to pen the side armor for. Next thing is use the move order instead of the attack move order where appropriate. So what do I mean by that? This doesn't mean walking across a long road or something like that. This is not where you want to use the move order instead of the attack move order. Where you want to use this is when you just hop from one building into the next one, because there might be one small line of sight where your unit might spot another unit and then it could get stuck shooting at that. You don't want to do that. Just walk into the next building and then fight from that building on, where it's much better. Of course, this is always, when this is appropriate, is always very situational. It also depends a bit on the matchup. If you know, for example, that you can't win an engagement from the open with an opponent that might be in cover, then it makes a lot of sense. If your opponent's infantry is so trash that you will win an engagement even if your opponent isn't cover and your unit is not, then the Q move might actually be better. Next thing is, we've already touched it, turn off auto cover when needed. You can really grab flags sometimes and hold them by just having a unit hiding behind a building. You might need to be a little bit precise with where you position it, but this can work wonderfully. So try to use it whenever needed. And once again, use return fire as well, where it suits you. If a unit is facing a lot of armor, why not turn on return fire? Because as soon as your unit starts shooting at some infantry, I will just get absolutely smoked, and you don't want to have that happen, especially if it has some AT, because that means that your opponent might get too close with his tanks and you might be able to kill them. Now, use smokes. This is both true for your mortars, for example, as well as your infantry units. In towns, of course, the line of sights are very narrow very often, so it's easy to block them off with smoke by flamethrowers, Sturmpyros, leaders, whatever it is. Next thing is hide units in backyards. This is especially for armor, but you can put the armor in backyards and it is better hidden than usually. This is a very nice thing that you can do in towns, especially if your armor is just sitting there. There's nothing to do for now because you're just defensive. Just put it in the backyard. It's much easier for your opponent to spot it, and you might actually be able to ambush him if he tries to push. And the next thing is building hopping. So you can, of course, building hop, right? We actually going to get to that again in the advanced part, but this is especially true with AT, where you want to do this. So if you know that a vehicle is on the other side, you might want to approach that building from your side where it's safe. Then you can hop in, shoot, hop out again. And if there's more than one vehicle, you might, as soon as your AT weapon has reloaded on your infantry, you can hop in the building again, shoot, and hop out again. The hopping is instantaneous, right? So you're gonna suddenly appear in line of sight of that unit, and yeah, you're gonna get the shot off and then hop out. So this is what you want to do. Now, this is very important to mention that all of these, the previous one as well as the next one, because we're going to get to the advanced one, are neat tricks if you have spare micro. But you don't want to focus on those when you should rather focus on the rest of the game, right? So very often less experienced players focus on these really neat micro elements, but you kind of ignore the macro part of the map of the game where you have to kind of manage where you want to push, where you have to defend. You're not paying attention, you might actually lose a flank because of that, or you micro some fancy little CQC unit in a town, but you have an important expensive unit like a tank dying because you do not micro it correctly. So make sure that you do all of these kind of tricks when you do have the capability to micro them. Don't just do them to win that one infantry CQC engagement in the town, for example, when at the same time you have a IS-2 dying, okay? One thing that you can do is T-attack ground with heavier guns. You can also do this with 50 cals. There's a lot of things that can do that, guerrillas, for example, as well. And you can do that in the middle of the road if you know that on the side units are hiding in buildings and you're not going to be able to get through them because maybe they're CQC units and you have to hop through the buildings and you can't get there. That will pin them eventually, and then you can move in and surrender them. This is a very effective thing. Works well with anything that has enough blast. So, for example, with small arms, it's not that great. But with a lot of other things, it can work really well. Also, if you know for a fact that a unit is hiding there, sometimes even if you come from an angle where your line infantry could see it, I have had this, where the CQC unit just wasn't spotted for some reason, and the line infantry couldn't spot it. You could also do that, right? So even if you have direct line of sight onto the building, you just do that and it will work as well. Now, the next thing is flame and satchel dodging. So whenever a unit shoots flames or throws a TNT, you will see that happening and you can hop out of the building. And this will basically take away most of the damage. And you can do this with anything really that is thrown. I count flame for being thrown here as well. Really, you take hardly any damage or suppression. This is a really useful tool that you have, and this is especially useful if you have SMG units that go against TNT throwers in towns, of course. But you can do this with anything. Now, the other thing that you also have to know is that you can also get close enough that a TNT unit or a flamer cannot use their special weapons. This is very good for Seekers units as well. You can also occupy the same building as another unit. So for example, against a flame unit or a TNT unit, you can get into the same building. If a unit has more, and then it will only be the SMGs that are going to be shooting. So if a unit has more SMGs, that is really favorable for you. For example, if you have a fight Afto versus Pioneer, the Pioneer doesn't, I think he has one MP40, and that's about it. So yeah, just do that, and you should be able to win that engagement. And rifles, of course, you'll also shoot. Forgot about that. But this is kind of how it goes. So this is another neat trick that you can do when it comes to the CQC. The other thing that you can do is you can kind of bait out satchels with cheap units, or with a vehicle that can kind of take the punch, and that will usually survive, and then you can move in with your infantry. But it is very situational, so this is not always possible. And I'm sure there are many more of these available. This is just the ones that I know and that Yapasa told me. Some of them I also didn't know. But yeah, that's those that are available that I can give you. Now, the final tip for town fighting. The final tip is sometimes you can also just work around the town. If there is a lot of CQC hiding, you don't want to drive or walk past it in the town, but you can do so outside of town. Now, you have to bear in mind that those units are there, and this is going to be a problem if you want to call reinforcements through that town. And they can also, you also have to still have something that can prevent them from actually pushing forward, because otherwise you lose them somewhere in your backlines, and that's absolutely devastating. Okay, so you have to be very, very careful with that. But even just pushing around often enough, you will spot them, and you can kind of make this work. So this is something that you can keep in mind as well. This is an option that is available to you. Just have to make sure, is it safe? Because of course, outside of town might be guarded by support weapons, AT guns, and so on. So you have to be a little bit smart with how you do it, but this sometimes can be an option as well. And with that, I think you have at least some basic knowledge about town fighting that should get you started. And yeah, thank you all for watching. Now, I just want to say again, this is of course not the most complete town fight guide there is. There's a lot more to it. Some things also come with experience. So unfortunately, the town no guide can really help with that. You just have to experience it yourself and learn from it. But yeah, and then also if you have any further questions, just ask in the comments. If you have any feedback, be it positive or negative to this guide, please let me know as well. And of course, also check out the comments for comments from better players than myself that might add their opinions here and tell you where they agree or disagree, or maybe give you some additional tips and tricks that I've not found their way into this video. So yeah, thanks again. Have a great day and see you next time.